Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Okay, how are you?
Not too bad. I think that's good. Yeah. Okay. Long weekend.
Yeah, it was the bat mitzvah good?
It was amazing.
Yeah.
Just amazing.
Were
Yeah.
there people there from the synagogue?
Not a lot. Not a lot.
Yeah, some of the people had said they didn't want to go. They didn't feel comfortable, that they didn't feel that they were really invited. And then I reread the notice, and it sounded like we were the guests.
Well, what
Really,
they would,
I
I think
mean,
what they were trying to convey is they wanted the regulars. They didn't want 100 gawkers to come.
but I know I took one call on Wednesday morning, somebody that was concerned about it. And then a number of people had said they weren't going because they didn't feel comfortable, that it was kind of weird.
Okay.
So,
It's really a one-off, and it's a COVID thing, and that's it. So
yeah.
it is what it is. I don't
I
want to make more out of it.
I noticed they were not wearing masks.
Right, because it was outdoors. And they're
Was
both,
it,
yeah, both parents are doctors at MD Anderson. They're very aware of things.
was it in the tent?
It was an outdoor tent. In other words, there are no sides to it.
Oh, no sides, just a cover.
Right. But it just magnificent.
Yeah.
You gotta have no sides. If you have sides, you might as well be inside.
Right, right. Yeah, and they did the same thing at the party last night. It was the size of a football field. But I mean, this is
Really?
yeah,
It was,
amazing.
they must have quite a large yard.
Well, it wasn't there. It wasn't theirs. They used a friend of theirs who lives near the synagogue, so that people could walk. That was the intent.
It was
Where
the
was the
same
actual-
house. They had
Mark,
the
where was
ser-
the service yesterday? Where was it actually?
Right
very
on
pretty.
right on Bel Air by the Evelyn Park.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and was unbelievable.
Nice
How many
kid.
times in your life do you get to meet Sheryl Sandberg?
Oh, yeah.
Great kid.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
my
amazing.
problem is I have a very poor opinion of Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg. They're damaging the world big time and making
Yep.
money at it.
Yeah, understood.
I was really gonna come, and then when people said they weren't coming, and then I read the
Yeah.
notice,
Well-
I said, I feel kind of funny about it. I didn't want
Yeah.
to intrude.
Well, it's a one-off, and that it's done. And next, we do have a just share with you. Fred Levine passed away this morning.
Oh my
Oh,
God,
wow.
really?
Oh,
Yeah,
gosh.
yeah.
Oh my God.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
How old
we-
was he?
He just had his 90th birthday party a couple months ago.
Now, he obviously has been in poorer health than Velva because we've seen her a lot and not him, right?
Yeah, yeah. He's had some dementia along the way, but in the last month, he's been it's been bad. Rabbi and I went to visit him last week, and he's on morphine, so you can imagine the conversation.
No good. no
Oh,
good.
wow. Didn't know. I hadn't seen them in a long time, so I don't even think they were at High Holidays.
They were staying home. Velva was staying in the apartment.
Yeah.
You know, at 90 years
sorry,
old. don't play.
I just joined late. Is there bad news about Fred Levine?
Yes, he passed away.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the funeral will
We knew it
probably
was
be
coming.
Tuesday. Yeah.
Yeah, we knew it was coming, but it's always hard.
90 is a pretty good inning, and he's done wonderful things with his life. So
Yeah, for sure.
Enter.
Brother.
Good
Yes.
morning. Phyllis, good morning.
Good morning, Leslie.
May I ask what we just entered? May I ask what you were just
Fred,
speaking of?
yes, Fred Levine passed away.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
So sorry.
Oh,
Do you have an idea of when the funeral will be?
In all likelihood, Tuesday at 2 o'clock, but it's not finalized.
Okay. At the synagogue?
At the Sharon Falls. The details are literally happened within the last hour.
Okay.
so
Mark,
sorry.
you're fading, you're cutting out.
Okay. I'm not sure. Perhaps, yeah. If we get better option here, I'm not sure what else to do. Everybody's freezing up.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
frozen.
Can you hear me?
Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah, we can hear you.
Can hear you right
All right,
Maybe-
worst case scenario, it's not such a put 'em you have to see. It's okay. All right.
maybe
As long as you
everybody,
can hear me.
maybe people should stop the video. I think that,
Makes no difference.
you don't think so?
No.
As
not
long
the way
as you
this-
can
it's
hear
not the way
me,
Zoom
Gail, it
works.
doesn't matter. You can see me
doesn't
great,
matter
but
what
as
you
long as you
do.
can hear me,
Yeah.
yeah.
We can hear you fine. There's no problem there.
Good morning. And we're gonna wait about another 2 minutes and we'll get started.
Yeah, it's just, the message here is that Bris Shalom's bandwidth is low.
Not much, I can't do much with that.
Yeah.
You're certainly talking to the wrong person. Hi, Gail. Jeff Myers says hello, Gail.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
Hello, Jeff.
There we
You
go.
can
This
say hello to everybody.
Hi,
is like
Mark.
romper room.
Hi, Jeff.
Where is Jeff? I don't see him.
He's here in the sanctuary.
Oh,
Came live.
You should get up
That's right.
there and wave to everyone. Hello,
Right.
Joyce. I can.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sandy. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Lori, Iris, David,
Good morning.
Natalie.
Cantor, when
Alex.
you said romper room, oh my goodness, that was with
That's a
the,
trip.
with the glass, icy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
We're dating ourselves, but
that's
what
for
we do.
sure. Boy, do I remember that.
absolutely.
Yeah, we're
That's
dating
what I
ourselves.
grew up with.
Hi, Iris.
We're dating
Yeah.
ourselves and
Hello.
we make a very good date.
Yep.
Yeah,
Hey, listen, I was on the Howdy Doody show. That's
There you
dating
go.
myself even more.
oh, well, no, I
Howdy
love
doody.
Howdy Doody.
All right, my friends, we're gonna get started.
Okay, let's
Okay.
mute.
All right, so let's mute everybody and go from there. Try what I can do with this end.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. So we're up to Unit 4, and we're looking at Jews, slavery, and the Civil War period of time. Let's just jump ahead a little bit to frame the discussion. 1991, the Nation of Islam's, the secret relationship between the blacks and Jews proclaimed the following. They said Jews funded, masterminded, and dominated the Atlantic slave trade, and Jews bore monumental culpability for all that slavery wrought. So the question is there any legitimacy there? All right, so let's look back. Going to Europe, by the time that the Africans began to be exported to the Americas in significant numbers around 1570, Europe's rulers had already forced the overwhelming mass of Europe's Jews eastward to Poland, to Lithuania, and to the Ottoman Empire. So there weren't that many Jews involved in this process because they weren't there. Two, in a Europe intolerant of Jews, it was virtually impossible for Jews to hold any kind of managerial position in slave trading entities. That isn't to say there weren't some, but it was really out of the norm. There weren't many Jews there, and they weren't particularly popular. And so it's really unlikely that the Jews had major roles of any kind, although as you'll see, they probably represented the people amongst whom they lived. A report to the 1853 meeting of the leading anti-slavery society accurately described Jewish attitudes, and that's reading number 1. And unfortunately, I'm going to do the readings, and a couple of them are long, and I apologize, but it's a way to keep us all together. The Jews of the United States have never taken any steps whatsoever with regard to the slavery question. As citizens, they deem it their policy to have everyone choose whichever side he may deem best to promote his own interests and the welfare of the country. The objects of so much prejudice and unrighteous oppression as the Jews have been for ages, surely they, it would seem, more than any other denomination, ought to be the enemies of caste and friends of universal freedom. All right, so that's a perspective from the 1850s. However, okay, their European and experiences and their religious traditions, their low economic status, their minimal educational background, and the fear of an anti-Semitic backlash made them politically uninvolved. They were detached from controversial causes outside of the scope of Judaism. And that's where we're going to look at. That's what we're going to look at today, is the various responses. All right, Jews in the South. Let's go south first. All right. Most of the Jews who lived in America at this point arrived in the decade and a half prior to the Civil War. They're mostly of German influence. All right. In 1848, the Jewish population in America was 50,000. By 1860, 12 years later, the number was 150,000. And 17 years later, following the war in 1877, the number had reached 270,000. And so the mass number of people that are in the United States at the beginning and during the war are people that have arrived in the decade just prior or during the war itself amongst Jews. The immigrants were primarily young Jewish men who were neither the poorest, they couldn't afford to come, or the wealthiest of the population. They didn't need to leave, all right? And so this is what came here, and they were highly motivated to fit in and to follow the ways of their new land. It would seem to be realistic to conclude that Jews who could afford to own slaves and had the need to do so did. All right. Jewish owners of slaves were not exceptional figures. Slavery in the South was an axiomatic foundation of the social pattern of the Old South. And Jews are looking to acclimate themselves in every single way to the environment, in both social and psychological ways, and to be perceived as equals in their society.
Did I turn the volume off? Where's the sound? Why am I not getting sound?
You have it on the TV?
Okay.
You have the sound?
David Finger, you need to.
I did. Okay. Yeah. The behavior of the Jews towards the slaves and slavery in general seems to have been indistinguishable in the South, that of non-Jewish friends. Southern Jews were more likely to quote the 3rd century Talmudic maxim that the law of the land is the law, and with it the basic behaviors, and to regard the institution of slavery as part of the law which they were bound to uphold. Okay? No Jewish political figure from the South expressed any relation to the justice of slavery or the rightness of the Southern position. No political figures. Judah Benjamin, the name you probably, if you know anything about this time, it's a name that you do know. Judah Benjamin, a senator from Louisiana, upheld the morality and the legality of the institution of slavery in the halls of Congress. He had served at different times in the Confederacy as the Attorney General, as the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of State. Despite being intermarried and a lack of personal religious observance, he acknowledged his Judaism, and people identified him as a Jew. So as far as it was recognized clearly, he was Jewish. And his passion for the Confederate cause and his wise counsel to President Jefferson Davis, to whom he was one of his primary advisors, was invaluable during the war. But anti-Jewish sentiment aimed at that time was nonetheless there. And certainly once the South began to lose the war, you know where they attributed the blame. It's the Jew. And he ultimately has to flee and resettle in England, and where he becomes a highly respected lawyer. Now, I'll tell him, if we have time at the end, I'll share a little bit about him, but I don't want to make this about Judah Benjamin. Another issue at play, the small number of Jews. All right, again, we're talking about even 150,000 Jews in the entire country, mitigated against the creation of a distinctively Jewish approach to any political or social question. Additionally, not only were they small in number, it wasn't like Ireland. They were spread out amongst all over the country outside of the New York region, and all over, and so particularly in the South, okay? And so therefore, their opinions were more likely to be derived from their non-Jewish neighbors than Jews, because that's where they were living. The truth at the end of the day is that the history of slavery would not have differed one iota from historic reality if not a single Jew had lived in the South. It would not have changed a thing. Comments, thoughts before I go on? Okay.
I have a question.
North. Let's take a journey north. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question about, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I have a question about the Jews being involved in the slave trade, very small numbers. I had read somewhere that, you know, they were exporting their goods, and from an economic standpoint, the ships had to come back, and it would have been, you know, uneconomical for them to come back empty. So in that respect, they might have been involved in the slave trade. Have you read anything like that?
Yeah. No, I definitely have read that. And it wasn't just Jew. The assumption is that, okay, all the shipping industry was Jewish. That's not true. Yeah, I would say to you, they acted in proportion to the general population. So yeah, that is no sense economically the opportunity. You take American goods to Europe, and then you and to come back with an empty ship it doesn't make economic sense. And so if someone will pay you to bring slaves across the sea, they probably took advantage of it. I'm sure the entire shipping industry, that was part of the way in which they did business. Far be it for anybody to allow ethics to get in the way of a good dollar.
Yeah, Ken Levine, what was exported from America was more raw product.
And Sandy, it broke up. Say it again.
Okay, what was exported from America tended to be raw ingredients, and the manufacturing tended to be more in Europe.
Right, that's correct. Right. What he said is that in terms of the way business was done, it was raw materials that would come from America and go to Europe, and the manufacturing they was set up for it would happen in Europe. And so they were sending the raw materials there. And what were they bringing back? Slaves. Okay. That's, again, I'm not whitewashing Jewish involvement. What I'm just suggesting is that it's in proportion to everybody else, they were part of the society, plain and simply. They didn't distinguish themselves either positively or negatively. All right, heading north, the great majority of the Jewish community in the north was generally opposed to slavery and contributed some workers to the abolitionist cause. But it's never simple, because the abolitionists drew motivation and inspiration from their evangelical Protestant convictions. And so they moved in circles. The abolitionists moved in circles that sought conversion of Jews to Christianity through active missionizing. And as a result, within that group was a great deal of animosity towards Jews. In the writings of William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most prominent of the abolitionists, find reading number 2. Oh, the rottenness of Christendom. Judaism and Romanism, meaning Catholicism, are the leading features of Protestantism. I am forced to believe that as it respects the greater portion of professing Christians in the land, Christ has died in vain. In their traditions, their forms and their ceremonies, their vain janglings, their self-righteousness, their will worship, their sectarian zeal and devotion, their infallibility and exclusiveness, they are Pharisees and Sadducees. They are papists and Jews. The abolitionists were not welcoming the Jews. They're fighting for the rights of slaves, but Jews were to be converted in process. And so in large part, what happened, the Jews reciprocated the suspicion and the disfavor. It's hard to love somebody who hates you. And a number of rabbis, even those who clearly opposed slavery, considered abolitionists to be reckless agitators and warmongering Christian zealots. And historians are therefore not exactly surprised that few Jews joined the ranks of the abolitionists. And it also explains why there was somewhat of a significant movement for Jews to move south. I want to talk a little bit about the movements within Judaism. There is no conservative Judaism at the time. It's not officially Orthodox, but there's an Orthodox framework, and there's not officially Reform. It's a Reform framework, but I'm going to talk about those two. Except for the Orthodox rabbi Sabbato Marias of Philadelphia, there were virtually no Orthodox Jews who spoke out in the anti-slavery movement. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Morris Jacob Rafal, an Orthodox rabbi, accused the abolitionists of being impulsive disclaimers, gifted with great zeal, but little knowledge, more eloquent than learned. He accused the abolitionist preachers of perverting the meaning of the Bible. And he goes so far to say that slaveholding is not a sin, for slave property is expressly placed under the protection of the 10 Commandments. You'll find a number of places where it mentions slavery in the 10 Commandments. However, the German Reform rabbis and Reform Jews became avowed abolitionists. Rabbi David Einhorn was an abolitionist and one of the founders of German and American Reform Judaism, and he believed that there was a fundamental relationship between the rights of Jews and the rights of blacks, because there could be no freedom for minorities in an atmosphere of enslavement. If there is an innate inferiority argument, such is dangerous because it can be applied to any oppressed minority. He sums up the new creed when he said that Reform Judaism believes, quote, in one humanity, all of whose members being of the same heavenly and earthly origin, possess a like nobility of birth and a claim to equal rights, equal laws, and an equal share of happiness. So that's, you've got two sides of the equation. Michael Halpern, who's also Reform, he attacks the views of the Orthodox Rabbi Rafal on several levels. First, he says that he argues that this pro-slavery rabbi has mistranslated the Hebrew in the word eved as a slave, and as a servant or bondman. Let me say up front, this is not as clear as he's making it. However, let me give you the two sides. Clearly, we sing Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves in Egypt. This is clearly slavery. At the same time, every week in the service that we chant, we finish the Kedusha on Shabbat morning, and Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko ki eved ne'eman karatalo. Moses was happy with his portion as an eved of Adonai. It's clearly not a slave in that context. Okay, so like in English, words can have multiple intents. If things were absolutely clear, there'd be no reason for midrash. All right, that's why we have midrash. All right, it's not clear. And this debate at the end of the day is transcending the slavery controversy. It's really a discussion of the way that the two different approaches, it reflects the two different approaches to the Bible. Orthodoxy insists on a literal translation. Reform says you need to look at it in a critical, liberal spirit and understand all the possible influences on the text, everything from archaeology to language and looking at linguistic sources. And then there were those in the middle. You have Rabbi Reform leader Isaac Meyer Wise of Cincinnati, who takes somewhat of a middle ground. He is fearing that the abolitionists were fanatics opposed to immigrations and Jews alike. And most important of all, Wise felt that the status quo of live and let live policy had been good for the Jews. At the end of the day, Jews have thrived in a position of calm. Anytime there's been conflict, even if it didn't relate to them, that's where Jews suffer. Okay, and so his words suggest that it was proper to perpetuate slavery in order to prevent succession and the war that came with it. So what I want to do now, these are a couple long readings. I want to read you the words of Rabbi Morris Rafal, the Orthodox rabbi, and then I want to read you the words of Einhorn, the Reform rabbi. I want to give you this text in its sources, so you can have a sense of the fullness of what they're implying. So first is Rabbi Morris Rafal. He gives all right, and he starts out, this is January of 1861. He says, on December 14, 1860, President James Buchanan issued a proclamation calling on the people of the United States to observe a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer throughout the Union, in view of the present distracted and dangerous condition in our country. And in response to this, that's the condition in which Rafal is now delivering his address to the congregation. And his congregation in New York is actually B'nai Jeshurun, as I learned the other day, okay? If they truly and honestly desire to save our country, let them believe in God and in his holy word. And then, when the authority of the Constitution is to be set aside for a higher law, they will be able to appeal to the highest law of all, the revealed law and word of God, which afforded supreme sanction to the Constitution. There can be no doubt, my friends, that however much of personal ambition, selfishness, pride, and obstinance that may enter into the present unhappy quarrel between the two great sections of the Commonwealth, I say it is certain that the origin of the quarrel itself is the difference of opinion respecting slaveholding, which the one section denounces as sinful, aye, as the most heinous of sins, while the other section upholds it as perfectly lawful. It is the province of statesmen to examine the circumstance under which the Constitution of the United States recognizes the legality of slaveholding, and under what circumstances, if any, it becomes a crime against the law of the land. But the question whether slaveholding is a sin before God is that one that belongs to the theologian. I've been requested by prominent citizens of other denominations that I should observe on this day, examine the Bible's view of slavery as the religious mind of the country requires to be enlightened on the subject. The subject of my investigation falls into three parts. First, how far back can we trace slavery? Second, is slaveholding condemned as a sin in sacred scripture? And third, what was the condition of the slave in biblical times and among the Hebrews? He starts out, is slaveholding condemned as a sin? How can this question at all arise in the mind of any man that has received a religious education and is acquainted with the history of the Bible as a phenomenon I cannot explain to myself, and which 50 years ago no man dreamed of, but we live in times when we must not be surprised at anything? Well, that sounds familiar. All right. Receiving slavery as one of the conditions of the society, the New Testament nowhere interferes with or contradicts the slave code of Moses. It even preserves a letter written by one of the most eminent Christian teachers to a slave owner on sending back to him his runaway slave. And when we refer to the history and requirements of our own sacred scriptures, we find that the most solemn occasion therein, recorded when God gave the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. It says, slaveholding is not only recognized and sanctioned as an integral part of the social structure, but the property in slaves is placed under the same protection as any other species of lawful property. When it is said, thou shalt not cover thy neighbor's house, or his field, or his male slave, or his female slave, or his ox, or his ass, or in aught that belong to thy neighbor. When you remember that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Job, the men with whom the Almighty conversed, all these men were slaveholders. Does it not strike you that you are guilty of something little, very little short of blasphemy? My friends, I find, and I'm sorry to find, that I am delivering a pro-slavery discourse. I am no friend to slavery in the abstract, and still less friendly to the practical workings of slavery. But I stand here as a teacher in Israel, not to place before you my own personal feelings and opinions, but to propound to you the word of God, the biblical view of slavery. Concerning the condition of the slaves in biblical time and among the Hebrews, the slave is a person in whom the dignity of human nature is to be respected. He has rights. Whereas the heathen view of slavery, which prevailed at Rome, and which I'm sorry to say is adopted in the South, reduces the slave to a thing that can have no rights. The result to which the biblical view of slavery leads us is, number one, that slavery has existed since the earliest of times. Number two, that slaveholding is no sin, and that slave property exists expressly placed under the protection of the Ten Commandments. And three, that the slave is a person and has rights, not conflicting with the lawful exercise of the rights of the owner. Boy, is that an open statement. Okay. I'll take any comments. Obviously, this is very uncomfortable, but I'll take comments. Okay,
Chaplain Levine,
yeah.
Levine is David. I'm gonna need my picture. I'm gonna say something real quick.
Good.
So what I hear, the difference is that they have rights, and that the difference between the biblical version and what morphed to Roman and then the United States was really the rights were taken away, or not. That was not really transpired. Is that what I'm hearing? Is that correct?
Yeah, so right, he is drawing a distinction between Roman slavery and Southern slavery, and that of the slavery of the Bible as Jews instituted it. Again, not Egyptian slavery, but necessarily as Jews implied it. Under Jewish law, there are limits to how you can treat a slave, and you know, in terms of the amount of work you can do, the kinds of work you can insist they do, and as well as time limits. You know, slaves also had to be given days off. They had to be given Shabbat. They were not supposed to be working more than 8 hours a day. You had to provide them with decent housing. So it's the same term, but obviously can be used differently in different societies as to what slavery ultimately means. Nonetheless, its overall implication is a loss of any kind of control of one's life. That's true.
Thank you.
All right, I want to read now David Einhorn's response. Okay, this is reading number 4. This is January 9th. It's 5 days later. David Einhorn composes a vigorous critique as follows. This is not the first time we have had occasion to admire the originality of Dr. Rafal, but we would never have given him credit for the originality in the sermon which he delivered on January 4th and published in the New York Herald, and in which he claims for the institution of slavery the sanction of the Bible in language the most positive and decided. The question restricts itself exclusively to this: is the institution of slavery per se a moral evil, or is it not? And here it is that Dr. Rafal earns for himself the sorry reputation of declaring on the authority of divine law the legitimacy and moral rectitude of slavery, and invades sharply against Christian ministers who happen to differ from him. A Jew the offspring of a race which daily praises God for deliverance from the bondage of Egypt, and whose fellow believers are to this hour groaning under the heavy yoke of slavery in most of the cities of the old world, and crying to the Almighty for help, undertakes to parade slavery as a perfectly sinless institution sanctioned by God, and to confront those presumptuous people who will not believe it with somewhat of an air of moral indignation. That's a long sentence. A more extraordinary phenomenon could hardly be imagined, but when the speaker, in the midst of his oratorical effort, becomes himself aware of the grandeur of his undertaking, and from a bosom overflowing with loving kindness, the following words escape his lips. I find, and I'm sorry to find, that I am delivering a pro-slavery discourse, but I stand here to propound to you the word of God. Then, in the end quote, then surely the crown of martyrdom must have descended upon his head had not the black skull cap at the time covered that enviable spot. A little humor in the middle of everything. In the history of creation, of which our pious speaker engages in his own creative efforts, takes not the least notice, we read, so God created man in his own image, and in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. That's Genesis chapter 1. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. This passage, he says, at least is devoid of any information respecting dominion over Negroes, excepted it be assumed that the latter are included in the class of animals that creep upon the earth. The Jew is conservative from principle, and intensely so in a land which in spiritual and material blessings offers him everything that he can desire. He wishes for peace almost at any price, and trembles, perhaps more than any other, for the perpetuation of the union, like a son for the life of his mother, sick unto death. I also share your patriotic sentiments with my full heart, and join you in the fervent supplication that God may answer right speedily our prayers for peace. But whatever party we may follow, we are not permitted to let the sanctuary of our religion be dragged into the political arena and made subservient to the interests of this or that party, as has been attempted with such publicity. And from his principles has been our pride and our boast and our weapon these thousands of years. This weapon we cannot yield without supplying our enemies with formidable means of attack. This pride and this boast we dare not and we will not suffer to be taken from us. It was unpardonable, the greatest triumph over our opponents and our certain destruction, to dearly exchange to the unstable and evanescent favors of the moment. Might it not be said, and with justice, as it has already been said in reference to the lamentable event which has called forth this disclaimer, look at these Jews. There, where they are oppressed, they cannot find words enough to boast of the humanity of their religion. But when they are free, their preachers pronounce on the authority of that solemn and most holy occasion on Sinai, the divine sanction of slavery. While Christian ministers in the South and in the presence of the representatives of the people advise moderation, sometimes openly deprecate or plead the forces of circumstances in extenuating of the established institutions. I am not a politician, and I have nothing to do with politics, Einhorn says, but to proclaim in the name of Judaism that God has consecrated the institution of slavery, such a shame and a reproach the Jewish religious press is in duty bound to disown and disavow, if both are not to be stigmatized forever. Okay, what are the arguments going on here? Let's pull some of this out. Both sides.
I mean, if you believe in the Bible word for word, got slavery in it.
Okay, so if you take the Bible word for word, it includes the institution of slavery. So what you
Well-
have here is, this is an argument that goes on. I see Martin kind of giggling. This is
Yeah.
an argument that goes on all the time. There are large global issues the Bible addresses. And then there are specific verses which often conflict. And so you're left with issues. Martin, I see you. Are you raising your hand or you just, are you
Yes,
kind of
I'm raising
grinning?
my hand. I'm raising my
Go
hand.
ahead, go ahead.
So here's my concern with this. You know, as you pointed out earlier, the exact English translation of a Hebrew word, the word eved in this case, which Rafal is saying the word eved in the Ten Commandments implies slavery as understood in the South of the United States. I think it's a complete conflation because the word eved is not well defined, could just mean a servant, could be someone who works for you. And the word slavery in the South is a political institution defined by law.
Mhm.
And there's no way our Bible has anything, clearly directly states anything with regard to the structure of law in the American South. And so for him to use the Ten Commandments to support a particular political legal institution in the South of the United States is a little absurd.
You can hear? Yeah.
Okay, if I could add, although, as I recall, the Torah does recognize the fact that there may be slaves of non-Jews, but for Jewish slaves, slavery has nothing to do with their race or their nationality or anything else. It was economic. They were poor. They were sold into slavery to pay off debts. They had definite rights, including the right to be free at the end of 7 years. It was not an argument that they were somehow subhuman, which is what the South's argument, among others, was, but it was in a temporary economic circumstance. And I think that's a huge difference from slavery in the South.
So there's no right and wrong here, because you're right. And for Jews, that's 100% on target in terms of how Jews were often became slaves as an economic response to owing debt. How do I pay off the debt? And at the end of 7 years, they were let free no matter what. There was a period of time, you're done, you're let free, but you had to be treated a certain way. But keep in mind that slavery as a general rule in the world, most of the time, really was a function of a war. When you took over another country, they had nothing to do with their race. It had to do with the fact that these were the people you defeated, and so you sold them into slavery. That was the nature of the beast. I cannot imagine that in early Israelite times that most of it was any different. It wasn't racially driven. It was probably they conquered somebody and they took the people as slaves. It wasn't a racial issue. All right? There are distinctions. Clearly there are distinctions, but at the same time, we can't ignore some of the parallels that exist as well. Anybody else? Yeah, Jeff.
Setting slaves free after 7 years, was that only for Hebrew slaves or did it extend to Gentiles?
So the question is the setting free of slaves after the 7-year period, did that apply only to Jews? My understanding is yes. Does anybody think otherwise? Please. That's my understanding as I understand it. Okay.
Cantor,
Yes.
I have a question that's a little bit different from this, and you may have already covered this and I didn't catch it. At this particular time, 1860s, were the majority of American Jews still living in the South, or was the majority in the North at this point?
While it's not like you're looking at 90%, the majority were North, but it's still, it's close. It's not overwhelmingly one way or the other. Jews have made their way west and south, you know, with the gold rush, with all the different things that have happened over that we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever I've lost track of time.
Earlier on, it had been the South that had the larger population.
That may be, but I believe by the 1860s it had shifted, and you know,
Okay.
to some extent.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So what we see here is that the rabbis, like almost everybody else, were torn. Some focusing on cherished principles, others seeking compromise due to for the sake of union and peace. Thousands of volunteer, thousands died on both sides. An estimate by Congressman Simon Wolf placed the number in Union forces at about 8,400 and the Confederate forces at about 10,000. These numbers are not absolute. We don't know for sure. It's an approximation, but we do know, if they're even close, that Jews were fighting in greater percentages than the general population. There were 9 Jewish generals in the north and several, we're not sure the number, in the south. Jews fought not only for their respective causes, but also for equal treatment for themselves. All right, that's the slavery issue at first. I'm going to leave that and sort of shift tones in this time. Okay. In the North, 2 events galvanized the Jewish community at large during the war. The first is the appointment of a Jewish chaplain to the military. And the second is General Grant's order number 11. All right, so let me address the first, the chaplain, and then we'll get to Grant's order. The American tradition of chaplaincy is as old as the United States itself. Clergymen served in the armies of the individual colonies almost from the first battle of the Revolution. And you see provisions being made for payment of chaplains as by the Continental Congress as early as 1775. So chaplaincy is an established fact. Okay. These chaplains, however, were all Protestant, though of varying denominations. The possible service of Roman Catholic chaplains received no attention until the time of the Mexican War. President Polk suggested that the bishops at that point appoint 2 priests to serve with the army in a civilian capacity, and that was adopted, but he had no intention of allowing them and recommending them for military appointment. Catholic priests served military posts in the capacity of chaplain, but their official status was open to question. And it's not until the Civil War that Catholic priests were explicitly granted the right to serve as army chaplains. No different for Jews. There's no evidence that the legal status of Jewish chaplains was ever discussed prior to the Civil War. But once the conflict had begun and thousands of Jews enlist in the armies of both sides, it's inevitable that they would demand a minister who could truly deal with their spiritual needs. The personal liberty, and what's at stake here, the personal liberties and civil rights of members of all religious minorities had been guaranteed by the Constitution, which clearly separated religion, church from nation. The chaplaincy becomes a test of that statement. How is it going to play? In the Confederacy, interestingly enough, this equality was apparently recognized immediately upon the outbreak of hostilities. And the acts providing for the appointment of chaplains in the Confederate military stipulated that they should be clergymen with no denominational specifications. There's no barrier to Jews serving as chaplains in the South. In the North, however, the original volunteer bill, as reported to the floor of the House, required that, quote, regimental chaplains who were to be appointed by the regimental commander on the vote of the field officers and company commanders present the regularly ordained ministers of some Christian denomination. Members of the House were failed to be moved by any of the arguments or the appeals of adjusting this law, and they reject any amendments to it. This is in 1860. This is middle of 1861. In September of 1861, 3 months later, a YMCA worker happened to visit the military camp in Virginia, popularly known as Cameron's Dragons. He was horrified to find that there was a Jew, one Michael Allen of Philadelphia, serving as the regimental chaplain, and promptly began such a agitation in the public press that ultimately the Assistant Adjutant General of the Army, George Ruggles, was forced to respond in writing in his official warning, and he said, any person mustered into the service as a chaplain with not a regularly ordained clergyman of a Christian denomination will be at once discharged without pay or allowance. So you have an official response. Allen, the Jew, in serving the capacity, is so humiliated by this that he resigns his commission under the guise of ill health rather than suffer the dishonor of dismissal from the service. But what happens as a result, this issue is raised in the public eye once again. And in response, the Board of Delegates of American Israelites began to press for the appointment of Jewish chaplains. Rabbi Arnold Fischel of New York's Shereth Israel, we've talked about it before, was delegated to investigate what's going on. And so writing to the board, Fischel notes, reading number 5. Now that I have visited all the hospitals in Virginia, I have a distinct idea of what has to be done and what can be done. The number of Jews in the army is very large. As a general rule, they are not known as Jews, but hundreds with whom I have conversed express their anxiety and hope that some provision may be made for them so that in the case of sickness or death, they may not be left to the mercy of strangers. Since they entered hospitals, they have, in addition to the sufferings of disease, to submit to the torture of religious controversy forced upon them by Christian clergymen who are anxious to save their souls.
Who's talking?
This is Rabbi Arnold Fischel. He's reporting to a board of Jewish board. This became public. All of the Jewish periodicals, recognizing the importance of this issue, carried it as significant news. They carried it as an editorial article on the question. They analyzed its legal and ethical aspects and prompted various courses of action. Legal battles, fights in the press, and political pressure followed. On July 17, 1862, that's 6 months later, the United States Congress voted to change the word in the law pertaining to the appointment of military chaplaincy from Christian denomination to religious denomination, leading to the official appointment of Rabbi Fischel himself as the first Jewish chaplain. Okay. Topic switch. Let's now look at the general order. Give you a little background here. Yes, sir. Question.
At that time, did chaplains administer to everybody in the?
Yeah, the question is, in that time, did chaplains minister to everyone? The answer is yes. So, you know, much like in the hospitals today, if you're a chaplain, you kind of tend to everybody. You've got to learn, you know, to be respectful of various different ways. All right. Caesar Caskell moved to Paducah, Kentucky in 1858, 2 years before the war, imagining he found the opportunity that he's been looking for. The newly incorporated city of Paducah, located on the Ohio River at the mouth of the Tennessee River, 15 miles up from the Mississippi River, was booming. Timely investments by city fathers in the stock of the New Orleans and Ohio Railroad brought Paducah excellent rail connections and a growing volume of trade. You've got this exploding city in Kentucky. Caskell and his business partner, Solomon Greenbaum, in case you weren't sure they were Jewish, Solomon Greenbaum, looked to participate in this prodigious growth, and they set themselves up in business. The Civil War disrupted economic life, however, in Paducah, and changed Caskell's life for the worse. The North began restricting Southern trade with Paducah as early as June of 1861, seeking to place economic pressure on the Confederacy. On September 6th, Grant and his troops captured and occupied Paducah, further restricting its trade with the South. Now, the state of Kentucky had declared itself neutral in the war, but Grant believed that the majority of Paducah's citizens would have preferred the presence of the Southern Army. Be that as it may, at least some, there were only 30 Jews in the city, but at least some of them publicly supported the Union's cause. Caskill was one of those who did so, and his brother Julius operated as a recruiter for the Union Army. The problem is, among others, the disruption of free trade in this city created bountiful opportunities for speculators and smugglers who always find a way to profit during wartime. Shortages and imbalances create the supply and demand out of the normal proportions. While merchants like Caskill were hoping to get trade permits from the north, nonetheless, there were many who found backhanded ways to line their own pockets, including many of the soldiers. In short order, what you've got is corruption, you've got mutual trust is declining, and you've got recriminations. And that is an environment that the Jew does not do well in. And so suspicions fell particularly upon the Jews, long stereotyped in Christian culture as being financially unscrupulous, and they became the focus of much of the hatred and mistrust of the war unleashed within the city. Unionists and Confederates both doubted the loyalty of the Jews, partly because they doubted the loyalty of all Jews, because Jews nationwide were known to be on both sides of the struggle. So how can you trust them? Many therefore assumed, even no one needs any kind of supporting evidence, that secessionists and Jews were engaged in a rascal conduct in Paducah, and that the widespread smuggling was carried out, as usual, chiefly by the Jews. And shortly after, as a surprise to the Jewish community, on December 17, 1862, General Grant ordered number 11, expelling all Jews as a class in the territory controlled by his army, which included the states of Mississippi, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Reading number 6 is that proclamation. 1, the Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Tennessee Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department. Within 24 hours from the receipt of this order by post commanders, they will see that all of this class of people are furnished with passes and required to leave, and anyone returning after arrested and held in confinement until an opportunity occurs of sending them out as prisoners, unless furnished with permits from their headquarters. 3, no passes will be given to these people to visit headquarters for the purpose of making personal application for trade. 4, the Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Tennessee Department and also Department order, number 1 are the same. I'm not sure why that happened. Number 5 and 6 apparently are the same too. So 1, 2, and 3 make up the whole reading. I'm not sure why it got duplicated. All right, that's general orders. The response you can imagine of the Jewish community was immediate and furious. Parents of Jewish soldiers fighting for the Union joined community leaders in mass protests and petitions. The New York Times referred to this order as one of the deepest sensations of the war, and American Jews protested by sending letters and telegrams to Washington. Following the time-tested traditions of Jewish politics, Caskill, who we had mentioned earlier, began by appealing to the highest governmental power available. And he travels to Washington and he meets with President Lincoln, who immediately rescinds the order. The president seemed to have no prior knowledge of the order. It hadn't reached Washington. And in the often quoted report, he resorts to biblical imagery in his interview with Caskill, a reminder of how many of the 19th century Americans linked Jews to ancient Israel and America to the promised land. Here's reading number 7. Again, it's a little tongue-in-cheek. It's midrash at its best. Lincoln says, and so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan. Caskill, yes, and that is why we have come under Father Abraham's bosom asking protection. Lincoln, and this protection they shall have at once. It's a great midrash, great midrash. It's probably not true, but nonetheless, the result is Lincoln does instantly command the general-in-chief of his army, Henry Halleck, to countermand the order. And you have here reading number 8. This is from Halleck. Major General Grant, a paper purporting to be a general orders number 11 issued by you December 17th has been presented here. By its terms, it expels all Jews from your department. If such an order has been ordered, it will be immediately revoked. We don't know why this happened. We don't know what was the motivation here. But what I can tell you is Grant has a very interesting place in American history. No one's 100% sure why he did this. At the same time, clearly, he fought the perception of being an anti-Semite in a lot of ways. It came up in 1868 when he ran for president, because the Jewish community at large did not forget this. And so they attacked him. And he went on the attack saying, this is not who I am, this is not who I am. And he ends up, when he becomes president, he appoints more Jews in his cabinet than any president had ever done before. So where his standing is in Jewish history is vague at best. But clearly this order was not a positive. I think I'm going to leave it there and ask for questions or comments.
Well, there's a whole book about this by a guy named Jonathan Sarna called When General Grant Expelled the Jews.
Yep.
And it goes into all the details about how later in his life he permitted Jews from Romania to immigrate into the United States without any restriction when there were pogroms there. And he sort of spent the rest of his life atoning for this.
Yeah. Yeah. And Sarna is a good read for American history in particular. And that book is really terrific. I agree. It was one of the sources I used in when I studied this time. And so I would recommend it. Jonathan Sarna, when Grant Expelled the Jews, is that the name? Yeah, okay. Worthy read. Anybody else? Jeff.
Were there Jewish plantation owners in the South?
The question is, were there Jewish plantation owners in the South? Well, I cannot name them. I'm going to say to you, yes.
But there definitely were.
Yeah, there had to be. They did not distinguish themselves from their neighbors. Plain and simply, if it was happening. What's that?
They owned land in the
Some,
South?
it probably wasn't in large number that they owned land, but those who did, those who had the opportunity and the finances to do so, did.
And in fact, there were black slave owners.
You're hearing here, there were black slave owners, which, by the way, is not, I want to tell you, I share with you something I read recently for one of the courses I'm taking. It was a journal article describing the Ethiopians who came to Israel. And I found this just upsetting and intriguing, etc. When they are in Israel, Israel had no idea, but the northern Ethiopians, there were two groups, there were northern and southern Ethiopians that came, were of a lighter skin and were keeping the southern Ethiopians as slaves. Half of the people that arrived in Israel were slaves to the other half of the Ethiopians.
Wow.
Now, obviously, once they found that out, it disappeared. All right. But they had no idea. There seems to be some level of human behavior that needs to be overcome on all levels. All levels. It's not just a white problem of slavery. It's a human problem.
In India, it's the caste system with the dark skin.
In India, the caste system with the dark skin. Right. Anybody else? Okay. I want to thank everybody. A wonderful Thanksgiving. We'll play again in 2 weeks. We have December, we have 3 sessions. Yes. Iris?
No, I just wanted to say thank you.
Okay.
Thank you and happy Thanksgiving.
Great session.
Thank you.
Have a
Wonderful.
good holiday, everyone.
Happy Hanukkah. Enjoy your sacrifice of a turkey.
Yes.
Enjoy your trip. Happy Thanksgiving and happy Hanukkah. Chag
Happy
Sameach.
Hanukkah.
Sandra, thank you so very much. And thank you
Yes.
for a beautiful bas mitzvah yesterday.
Thank you.
Very lovely.
So long, everyone.
Here we go.
So long.